Danny Price was 53 years old, and he had spent most of those years doing hard work in hard places. He had 11 years in the Earth Defense Corps as a combat engineer, before his knees and his patience both gave out around the same time. And after that, he had moved into colonial contract work. Dustfall was his 4th colony posting. He liked it well enough. The people were decent, the pay was fair, and the work, maintaining the thermal bore units that kept the colony's mining operations running, was the kind of steady, mechanical work that let his mind go quiet. He was running a diagnostic on Bore Unit 7 when his comm beeped, with Paige Ellison's quiet voice telling him to stay inside and not to go out for any reason. Paige was not the type to say things like that without a good reason, and the particular tone she used, calm, precise, no extra words, told Danny that the reason was serious. He turned off his work light without hesitating. The East Depot was a large, single-level building made of corrugated steel panels bolted to a polymer frame. It housed 3 of the colony's bore units, a rack of spare parts, 2 vehicles, and a long central workbench under which Danny had, on his very first week at Dustfall, bolted a compact shotgun in a magnetic clamp. The gun had been there for 3 years. Nobody had asked about it. It had never been needed. Danny had always believed that the fact that it was never needed was partly because it was there. He moved to it now, pulling it free from the clamp by feel in the dark, and then walked quietly to the far corner of the room where his back could be against 2 walls at once. Old habit. A good one. The bore units hummed at low idle, even when not actively drilling, and the wind outside made the steel panels flex and tick with a low, irregular sound. Danny listened past all of that, the way you learn to listen after enough years of paying attention to things that are trying to stay quiet. He heard the roof. It was one sound, a single heavy contact on the corrugated steel above him, enough to flex the panels slightly and send a brief change through the familiar rhythm of the building. Whatever had landed up there was heavy, much heavier than any animal on Vega 4 that he was aware of. He estimated the weight at close to 300 kilograms, based on how much the panel had moved. He did not move. He did not speak. He controlled his breathing and waited. It took about 40 seconds. Then a section of the wall on his left side, not the door, not a vent, but a flat section of the wall itself, punched inward. Not with a tool, the steel tore back like paper, and a shape began to push through the gap it had made. In the dark, Danny's eyes had adjusted well enough to see the outline of something very large entering the space. It was tall. It had to duck and angle itself to get through the gap, even though the gap was considerable. It moved with a kind of confidence that Danny recognized, the confidence of something that did not expect opposition. He fired the first shot from 8 meters. The sound in the enclosed metal building was enormous. The round hit the creature's upper torso and staggered it. He could see the impact clearly, even in the low light. Watch the thing rock backward. But it did not go down. It turned toward him. Fast. He fired the second shot before it had fully oriented on him, from 6 meters now, angling upward. This one hit differently. The creature made a sound that Danny had never heard anything make before. A high, fractured shriek that had no equivalent in any human or animal noise he had ever encountered in 53 years of living. It went backward through the hole in the wall, and then the sound of it hitting the frozen ground outside was followed by silence. Danny was already reaching for his comm. "Walsh," he said. "East Depot, I have something large and not human came through the wall. It's down outside, but I don't know for how long. It's approximately 3 meters tall. 2 of its limbs are structured differently from the others. It was wearing some kind of suit. Sending you position data right now." Connor Walsh's voice came back within seconds. "Understood. Stay in cover. Don't go outside." Danny had already moved back to his corner. Wasn't planning to. What happened in the next 4 minutes inside the colony was something that an outside observer might have found surprising. There was no panic, no shouting on the general channel, no flood of confused voices asking what was happening. The emergency protocol that Connor Walsh had designed and drilled with his team moved through the colony like a quiet current. Internal doors locking, people moving through pre-planned routes to reinforce sections, lights in the outer ring dropping to low setting while interior lights stayed normal. To anyone watching from outside, the colony would look almost unchanged. The outer pathway lights were still on. The machinery hum was still audible. Everything that would normally be visible was still visible. It was a protocol built on one idea: do not let whatever is outside know that you know it is there. Paige Ellison ran the internal coordination from the security room, moving people through the system with short, direct instructions, tracking everyone's location on her board, flagging the 3 people who had not yet checked in, and sending runners to find them. She worked with the focused, unhurried speed of someone who had rehearsed this enough times that the fear had been replaced by procedure. Luke Harmon arrived at the security room 6 minutes after Connor called him. He was thin, somewhere in his mid-40s, with wire-rimmed glasses and a habit of carrying a small notebook everywhere he went. He looked at the sensor display for about 30 seconds without speaking, then asked Connor what kind of suit the entity at the depot had been wearing. Connor relayed Danny's description. Luke wrote something in his notebook. Luke said, "I need 2 hours and access to the engineering bay." "For what?" Connor asked. "Something useful," Luke said, and left. Connor pulled up the Colonial Defense database and started cross-referencing Danny's description against known species records. The 3-meter height, the limb structure, the biosuit, the behavior pattern, moving at night, approaching slowly, testing the outer ring first, narrowed it down to a short list. Within 15 minutes, he had a match with high confidence. CareHFY. He had heard of them. Most people in colonial security had. They were not a political threat. They did not invade or occupy. They hunted. They had hit 3 other colony worlds in the past decade. The reports were not pleasant reading, but Connor read them carefully and noted one entry that he found particularly useful. The 3rd colony, Kepler 9, had repelled the CareHFY hunt group with significant CareHFY casualties. He read the Kepler 9 report twice. Then he began making a list of every person in Dustfall with military, law enforcement, or emergency response experience. The list had 31 names on it. He had not realized it was that long. Frontier colonies, it turned out, attracted a specific kind of person, people who had seen enough of the soft world to prefer the rough one. Outside in the dark, 200 meters from the East Depot, HFY lay on the frozen ground. The second shot had torn through the seal on the lower section of his biosuit and done significant damage to the tissue beneath it. He could still move, but every movement sent a sharp signal up through his side that he could not ignore. He pushed himself upright and made his way back toward the rendezvous point on the ridge, leaving marks in the frost that he did not have the capacity to think about hiding. He had not expected the human to be waiting in the dark. He had not expected the human to fire before he had even fully entered the building. Back on the ridge, Vorok Than looked at the condition of his youngest hunter and said nothing for a long moment. The hunt had begun, and the prey had already drawn first blood. He did not yet understand what that meant, but somewhere in the cold and focused place behind his hunt-trained instincts, something was shifting slightly. The first small doubt, no bigger than a splinter, that this world might not be what the data had suggested. He pushed the thought aside and began recalculating his approach. The next 6 hours did not go well for the CareHFY. Vorok Than had split his group after HFY returned injured from the depot. HFY was sidelined, his biosuit was compromised, and moving him around in the cold without proper thermal protection was a risk Vorok Than was not willing to take just yet. So he left HFY at the ridge shelter and sent the remaining 3 in separate directions, himself included. It was the standard CareHFY method for a fortified target. 3 points of pressure applied at the same time, overwhelming the prey's ability to respond in all directions at once. It worked on most worlds. Geth moved toward the south side of the colony, targeting the water reclamation unit. It was an outer structure, separate from the main hab ring, with a low profile and minimal lighting. On paper, it was an ideal point of entry, close enough to the main colony to provide access, but far enough out that any disturbance there might take time to be noticed. What Geth did not know was that the area between the colony's main ring and the reclamation unit contained a drainage channel that had been cut during the colony's early construction period to direct surface runoff away from the foundations. The channel was about 2 meters deep and roughly 1 meter wide, lined at the bottom with steel rebar supports that had been used during construction and never cleared out. It had a solid cover panel across the top that matched the color and surface texture of the surrounding ground. Geth stepped onto it at full walking pace. The panel held for about 1/3 of a second, which was long enough for him to commit his full weight to it before it gave way. He dropped 2 meters straight down into the rebar. The sound was loud enough to be heard inside the colony. Geth extracted himself after several minutes of difficult work. 2 of his secondary limb joints had taken serious damage in the fall and were no longer functioning at full range. His biosuit's thermal layer had also been torn along his right side, which meant the sub-zero air was now reaching his body directly. He could still move, but he was slower than before, and his heat signature masking was no longer working correctly on the damaged side. He began moving back toward the ridge, making the tactical judgment that continuing the approach in his current condition was not viable. Sorrel had gone toward the east face of the main hab ring, targeting an auxiliary ventilation shaft that ran along the outer wall. The shaft was wide enough for a CareHFY to move through with some difficulty, and the access cover on the outer end had a basic magnetic lock that Sorrel bypassed in under a minute. She pulled the cover free and began moving into the shaft. What the shaft access did not show on the external sensor map was that the junction point 20 meters inside, where the shaft split into 4 separate channels leading to different sections of the hab ring, had been flagged by Lena Burke as a potential weak point in the colony's internal security layout during an emergency review she had done 2 years earlier. Lena had mentioned it to Connor at the time, and Connor had quietly added it to his mental list of things to think about. Lena was Dustfall's chief medical officer. She was 38 years old, with dark hair usually pulled back out of the way, and the kind of direct, steady gaze that patients either found very reassuring or slightly unnerving, depending on their personality. She had been awake when the lockdown started, already on comms with Paige because she had heard the distant sound from the depot, and knew that a colony-wide silent lockdown at that hour meant something was outside. She had gone to the shaft junction with a flare gun loaded with the high-burn industrial flares she kept for emergency signaling in the event of a suit failure outdoors, and a nail driver, a construction tool used for sinking steel fasteners into polymer and composite panels, which happened to be sitting in the maintenance cupboard just outside the medical bay because someone had left it there 3 weeks ago and never come back for it. When Sorrel's leading limb came through the vent cover at the junction, Lena fired the flare gun first. The flare hit the biosuit's external sensor array, the cluster of sensory organs mounted on the suit's front face that the CareHFY used to boost their natural detection range, and ignited it. Sorrel pulled back sharply, and as she did, Lena discharged the nail driver twice into the limb before it cleared the vent cover. The nail driver was not a weapon, but it was pressurized at industrial setting, and at that range, it did what it did very effectively. Sorrel made a sound that Lena would later describe in her field notes simply as a high-volume distress vocalization, and retreated out of the shaft at speed. The biosuit's sensor array was burning. The limb had taken 2 nail impacts that had penetrated the suit material and lodged in the tissue beneath. Lena sat on the floor of the shaft junction for about 30 seconds, breathing carefully. Then she reloaded the flare gun and stayed where she was. Dunmac was the most experienced hunter in the group after Vorak Thun, and he was the most careful. He did not attempt a direct approach. Instead, he moved to a position on the outer colony wall, where a viewport, a small reinforced observation window set into the exterior of one of the Habring sections, gave him a clear line of sight into the interior. What he saw through that viewport stopped him. The humans inside were not hiding. They were not gathered in one place, shaking. They were moving with direction and purpose, communicating with small devices they wore on their collars or wrists, distributing supplies, reinforcing internal positions, checking on one another. The older ones were clearly directing the younger ones, but the younger ones were not waiting to be told twice. There was a young man. Dunmac estimated him at no more than 20 cycles of age by human reckoning, who was carrying sealed containers to a doorway alongside an elderly female, talking steadily into his comm badge at the same time, giving descriptions of everything he could see through the outer windows. Dunmac had hunted many species. He had seen prey fight back. Some species fought hard when cornered, out of fear and desperation, and it was that desperation that usually made them lose. They became erratic. They made mistakes. Fear was something a skilled hunter could use. These humans were not afraid. Or if they were, the fear was not touching the way they moved or thought. They looked. Dunmac searched for the right frame for what he was observing. They looked like a population that had been waiting for something difficult to happen, and had a plan ready for when it did. He reported this to Vorak Than over the group channel. The Huntmaster's response was brief. He acknowledged the report and told Dunmac to hold his position and observe. What Dunmac did not report, because he was not sure how to frame it in the language of hunt communication, was the feeling that had come over him watching the young man with the containers. There was something in the way that human moved that Dunmac did not have a category for. It was not bravery in the way Karath understood bravery. It was not aggression. It was something quieter and steadier than either of those things. It was as if the human genuinely did not consider the possibility that he was not going to be all right. Dunmac had never encountered that quality before in a prey species. Back in the security room, Connor Walsh had finished his list and was briefing his 31 people. They came from different backgrounds: ex-military, former police, emergency rescue workers. One woman named Carol Grant, who had spent 8 years as a crisis response coordinator on a high-conflict urban station. They ranged in age from 26 to 61, and they looked, to an outside eye, like a completely ordinary group of colonial workers. Connor gave them the information clearly and without drama. Karath hunters, estimated 5, 1 already injured and sidelined. 3 more known to be moving on the colony now. 1 Huntmaster unaccounted for, and likely planning something more significant than the probing attacks so far. He told them the Karath were experienced, physically formidable, and operating with good equipment. He told them the one colony that had successfully repelled a Karath hunt group had done it by refusing to let the Karath choose the time and terms of every engagement. They are very good at hunting, he said. They are not used to being hunted back. Nobody in the room said anything dramatic. A few people nodded. Carol Grant asked a practical question about communication frequencies and wrote down the answer. The man beside her checked his equipment and said nothing at all. Outside the viewport, Dunmac watched the lights of the colony and tried to find a word in the Karath language for what he was feeling. He could not find one. It did not exist yet. Luke Harmon came back to the security room after 2 hours and 40 minutes. He had a smear of machine grease on his forearm, and his notebook was open to a page covered in small, dense handwriting. He put the notebook on the table in front of Connor and pointed to a rough diagram in the center of the page. The Karath biosuit has a neural integration layer, he said. It links the suit's sensor systems to the wearer's nervous system. It is what makes their tracking enhancement work. It's a direct biological interface. Signal goes into the suit processes it, processed signal goes back into the wearer's neural tissue. Connor looked at the diagram. All right. That kind of interface has a vulnerability. If you push a concentrated electromagnetic pulse through a surface the suit is physically interfaced with, like a panel the hunter is actively using with the suit's contact points engaged, it travels back through the integration layer and into the neural tissue. It does not just damage the suit, it disrupts the nervous system of the person wearing it. Connor was quiet for a moment. Can you build something that does that? I already built it, Luke said. It's installed at the power core's external access panel. The Karath are going to target the power core. If they want to cause maximum disruption to the colony, that is the logical target. When whoever goes for it touches the panel and the suit interfaces with the system to begin an override, the pulse fires. How certain are you it will work? Luke considered this briefly. The physics are sound. The assembly is rough because I used what was available. But the components are rated correctly and the sequencing is right. I am reasonably certain it will work. Coming from Luke Harmon, reasonably certain was more confidence than most people gave at their absolute best. Connor put the notebook down. Good. Now let's talk about what happens to everyone else. The plan that took shape over the next 40 minutes was built around one central fact. 2 of the 5 Kareth hunters were already compromised. Hevrak was injured and out at the ridge shelter. Geth had taken a bad fall and retreated with structural joint damage and a torn thermal layer. That left Sorrel, Dunmac, and Vorakthan as active threats. Sorrel had also been injured by Lena's flare and nail driver, which likely reduced her effectiveness further, though by how much was uncertain. 3 active threats, at least one of them partially impaired, against 31 prepared defenders on ground the defenders knew intimately. Those were not bad numbers. Carol Grant took 6 people to cover the southern approach, focusing on the area around the water reclamation unit and the drainage channel where Geth had fallen. Their job was not to engage directly if it could be avoided, but to hold that line and make sure nothing came through it toward the main hab sections without a fight. Carol sent her people with the calm, organized efficiency of someone who had spent years managing situations where the variables were never fully under control. A man named Victor Clay, who had done 7 years in planetary defense before coming to Dustfall to work as an equipment operator, took 4 people and covered the ventilation access points throughout the hab ring. He knew the layout of the vent system better than almost anyone in the colony because part of his current job involved the air circulation systems that connected to it. He positioned his people at every junction point and told them simply, make noise, make light, and make it difficult. You do not have to stop them permanently. You have to slow them down and make them uncertain. Lena Burke was still at the shaft junction in the east vent system. When Victor Clay made contact with her over the comm to tell her he was securing that zone, she told him she was staying where she was, for now. Victor accepted this without argument. Lena had already demonstrated she could handle the position. Connor himself, along with a quiet ex-military mechanic named Gary Stout and 2 others, set up in the area around the power core. They did not crowd the access panel. They spread wide, in positions that would not be immediately obvious to something approaching the panel from outside, and they waited. Dunmac made his move first. He had been watching from his observation point near the viewport, and had identified the power core structure as the logical primary target. He moved to it from the western approach, using the colony's own machinery storage units as cover, moving between them slowly and with patience. He was at the outer access panel within 20 minutes. He touched it with the contact points on the front of his biosuit and began running the override sequence. Connor's team did not fire. They held. The panel interface gave Dunmac a low-level feedback signal almost immediately. The kind of thing that happened when a system was partly locked from the inside. Nothing alarming, just a standard resistance that told him the override was going to take slightly longer than a clean entry. He adjusted his approach in the suit interface and pushed further into the system. The pulse fired when the suit's contact engagement reached maximum depth. Dunmac dropped without making a sound. He hit the ground beside the panel and lay still, the biosuit flickering with irregular light pulses along its surface, the neural integration layer trying and failing to stabilize. He was not dead, but he was not moving either. What happened after that was fast and decisive. Geth, who had been trying to circle back and re-engage despite his injuries, was met by Carol Grant's team in the open ground near the southern wall. The engagement was brief and ugly for both sides. Two of Carol's people took injuries that were serious enough to pull them out of the action, but Geth ended it by retreating again, this time past the point where he could realistically threaten the colony further that night. He was moving toward the ridge. Soral came for Voruk-Than. She had watched the power core engagement from a distance on the CareHFY group channel and understood what had happened. She moved through the colony's outer area with the speed of someone who had stopped thinking about the hunt and started thinking about getting out. She found Voruk-Than on the ground beside the access panel, and what she found was not good. The pulse had gone deep. The biosuit's thermal regulation layer had failed, along with the neural integration system. The suit was no longer keeping the CareHFY's body temperature stable, and in the sub-zero night air of Vega 4, that was not a condition that could be ignored. Voruk-Than was alive. His breathing was audible, and his eyes were open. But his higher motor functions were not responding. He could not stand. He could not speak clearly. He was experiencing the kind of systemic shutdown that happened when a nervous system took a hit it was not designed to survive. Soral looked at him. She looked at the colony around her, the lights, the sounds, the clear evidence that this was not a situation she could fight her way out of. She looked at her huntmaster one more time. She keyed the Karath distress frequency on her comm and put her shoulder under Voruk-Than's arm. He was too large and too damaged for her to carry, but she could help him move, slowly, toward the ridge. She tried. She got perhaps 40 meters before it became clear that this was not going to work. Voruk-Than's body temperature was dropping fast. The biosuit was not just failing. It was actively trapping the cold against his body now, the damaged thermal layer pulling heat away from his core instead of holding it in. Moving him further into the open air in these conditions was going to kill him faster than leaving him. Soral set him down. She thought for a long moment. Then she made the only decision she could see that preserved anything at all. She left him where he was and went back to the ship. It was the hardest thing she had ever done in her life. The Karath had a word for leaving a hunt brother behind. It was not a word anyone used lightly. But she could not carry him to the ship, and staying on the ground with an injured huntmaster on a world that had just proven itself very effectively hostile was a decision with only one ending. She would bring the ship in as close as she dared and attempt a pickup. First, though, she needed to get Geth and Hevrak. And she needed to be fast. Inside the colony, Paige Ellison's calm voice came over the comm to Connor Walsh. "I have a signal on the eastern ground, about 40 meters past the power core. The sensor reading is large, stationary, and the thermal signature is dropping." Connor processed this for a moment. "It's alive?" "Yes, but the temperature reading is not sustainable. Whatever it is, it's going to go into critical cold exposure in the next 20 to 30 minutes if nothing changes." Connor was already reaching for the comm to call Lena Burke. Lena Burke did not hesitate when Connor explained what the sensors were showing. "What's the biological profile?" she asked. "Karath, Huntmaster. The biosuit has failed. He's losing core temperature fast." There was a brief pause. Does the Colonial database have field triage notes on carafe physiology? Some. From the Kepler IX incident. I'm sending them to your comm now. All right, Lena said. I'm going out. Connor started to say something about waiting for a full security sweep of the area around the power core, and Lena said, with the kind of voice that ended that kind of conversation, Connor, if we wait for a full sweep, he will be dead before I get there. Send someone with me if you want, but I am going now. Gary Stout went with her, carrying a light and a medical supply pack that Lena handed him without looking. Aaron Cole, the geology survey intern, was standing in the corridor near the medical bay when Lena came through pulling on her cold weather gear. He was 20 years old, still wearing the survey jacket he had apparently been wearing since the lockdown started, and he had been helping move supply containers for the last several hours without anyone asking him to. I can carry things, he said. Lena looked at him for about 1 second. Come on then. They went out through the eastern exterior door into the cold. The air hit hard. It was well below zero, and the wind had come up since midnight, cutting across the flat ground and carrying small particles of frozen grit. Lena walked at pace, following the sensor coordinates on her wrist display, her medical bag over one shoulder, and her breath coming in quick white clouds. Voruk Than was lying on his side on the frozen ground. In the light of Gary's lamp, he was enormous. Nearly 3 meters long, even curled as he was, the biosuit still flickering with the irregular failing light of the damaged systems. Lena crouched beside him without stopping her movement, opened her bag, and began pulling out the sensor unit she used for emergency field assessment. He was conscious. His eyes, which were large and compound in the way of his species, tracked toward her as she approached. There was something in them that she noted clinically and did not react to emotionally. Not yet. Something that was trying to assess her and failing, the way a system tries to run a program on hardware that is no longer responding properly. You are not going to die tonight, she said clearly, not because she thought he could understand her language, but because she had found over many years that calm, direct speech helped in emergency situations, regardless of whether the patient could parse the words. I am going to make sure of that. She read the sensor data and cross-referenced it against the Kepler IX notes on her comm. Karath core body temperature normal range, the note said, was approximately 4 degrees higher than human baseline. The temperature she was reading now was nearly 8 degrees below his species' normal range. That was the critical number. His nervous system was already partially shut down from the pulse discharge, and the cold was compounding it. The two insults together were pushing his body toward a shutdown point that would not reverse. Aaron, she said, in that pack there is a thermal wrap, the large silver one. Get it out. Aaron found it and handed it to her. Lena began cutting away sections of the biosuit with the industrial shears she had borrowed from the engineering bay, working quickly and systematically, removing the damaged thermal layer and the fused sections around the neural integration points. The suit material was unlike anything she had worked with before, layered in ways that took her a moment to map. But she approached it the same way she approached everything. Look at what is actually in front of you. Understand the structure. Work with it rather than against it. Gary held the light steady without being asked to, and did not say anything. This was one of the things Lena valued about Gary Stout. She got the thermal wrap around the main body mass and activated it. The wrap's internal heating element came on at the low setting she dialed in. She did not want to try to bring his temperature up too fast, which could trigger secondary complications. Slow and steady. She spent the next 3 hours on the ground beside him. She used everything in the field triage notes and more, adapting protocols from her training in cross-species emergency medicine, making judgment calls on dosage adjustments based on estimated body mass and metabolic rate, talking to the Colonial Medical Archive on her comm when she needed a second opinion on a question the Kepler IX notes did not cover. At one point, around 3 in the morning, she asked Aaron to hold a pressure line in place with both hands for 11 minutes while she worked on the other side of the wound. And he held it without moving or complaining for exactly as long as she needed. Around 4 in the morning, Vorok Than's core temperature was coming up. Slowly, but steadily. The neural shutdown was deeper. That was damage that a field team on an outer rim colony could not fix. It was going to need a specialist, probably more than one, and probably equipment that did not exist within several light years of Vega 4. But the question of whether he would live long enough to get to that specialist had shifted from uncertain to probable. Lena sat back on her heels and looked at the sky for a moment. The orange star of Vega 4 was still a few hours from rising. "Is he going to be okay?" Aaron asked. "He is going to be alive," Lena said. "The rest will take time." They moved Vorok Than into the medical bay using a loader vehicle that Luke Harmon drove out to the eastern ground. The colony's medical bay had not been designed for anything of his size, but Lena adapted it, extended the primary care table with a second one bolted alongside it, repositioned the monitoring equipment, requisitioned thermal blankets from storage. By the time the first gray light of morning came through the exterior panels, Vorok Than was stable, monitored, and as comfortable as the colony's resources could make him. The Karath ship had made one low pass over the colony in the early hours of the morning. It had not attempted a landing. It had not fired on anything. It had simply come low, as if looking, and then risen again and moved to a distant orbit. Soral had gotten Geth and Hevrak back to the ship. She had not been able to retrieve the Huntmaster. A Galactic Union diplomatic vessel arrived 31 hours after the incident was reported through the Colonial Authority emergency channel. It brought 2 mediators, a small security team, and a Karath diplomatic observer, one of the rare individuals of that species who occupied the unusual social role of cross-species liaison. Her translated name meant something roughly equivalent to "she who speaks after the hunt has ended." Her working name in the Galactic Union system was listed as Observer 711, but the mediators she worked with called her Vale. Vale walked into the medical bay and stood at the foot of the improvised extended table for a long moment. Vorok Than was awake. He could not move much, and his speech was still interrupted by the neural damage, but his eyes were tracking clearly, and his vital signs were stable. She looked at him. Then she looked at Lena Burke, who was at her desk beside the table, updating the monitoring log, still in the same clothes she had been wearing since the night before. There was a folding cot in the corner of the room, where Aaron Cole had eventually fallen asleep, still wearing his survey jacket. "Who provided care?" Vale asked. "I did the medical work," Lena said. "The rest of it was a colony effort." She looked at the improvised equipment, the notes taped carefully to every surface in Lena's handwriting, so that anyone coming in during the night would know exactly what had been done and what the current protocols were. She looked at Aaron, asleep in the corner. "He came to hunt your colony," Vale said. "I know that," Lena said. "And you treated him." "He was a living thing going into critical cold exposure," Lena said. "That is not something I walk past." Vale was quiet for a moment. The Careth network will receive an account of this hunt from Vorok Than when he is able to transmit. He has the right to frame it as he chooses. He may not describe your colony favorably. Lena looked up from her notes. "He can say whatever he wants. He's alive to say it." Vale looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at Vorok Than. The Huntmaster, from the extended care table, made a sound that the translation unit on Vale's collar rendered as something imprecise. It was not a word exactly. It was closer to an acknowledgement. The sound something makes when it is revising a conclusion it had previously considered settled. 3 weeks later, The account Voruk then transmitted to the Karath Hunt Network was read by more people than almost any hunt record in recent history. It was precise and detailed. It described every point at which the hunt had failed and exactly why. It described Danny Price waiting in the dark with the lights off. It described Lena Burke cutting through a damaged biosuit in sub-zero temperatures to stabilize the creature that had come to kill her colony. It described the young human who held a pressure line steady for 11 minutes in the middle of the night without being asked why. At the end of the account, Voruk Than used a word in the Karath language that the Galactic Union Translation Bureau flagged as unusual. The word sat somewhere between opponent worthy of deep respect and a category of being that does not fit any classification I was given. It was a word that had been used only a handful of times in recorded Karath history, and always to describe something that had genuinely surprised a hunter who believed they had seen everything worth seeing. The Karath network had no formal protocol for how to respond to that word being used about a prey species. They had never needed one before. In Dustfall, the colonists filed their incident reports, submitted their damage assessments to the Colonial Authority, and got back to work. The hole in the East Depot wall was patched. The drainage channel cover was replaced with a stronger panel. The sensor grid on the eastern ridge was recalibrated and expanded. Luke Harmon dismantled the pulse rig, cataloged every component, and returned them to engineering inventory with careful notes on the configuration, so that if anyone ever needed to build one again, they would not have to start from scratch. Carol Grant submitted a formal proposal to the Colonial Authority recommending updated emergency protocols for predator threat scenarios across all Outer Rim colonies, with specific reference to what had worked at Dustfall. The proposal was accepted 6 months later and distributed to 43 colony worlds. Danny Price replaced the corrugated panel on the depot wall himself because he said it was his department and he preferred to do it right. When he was done, he went back to the thermal bore units and continued the diagnostic he had been running on the night it all started. Aaron Cole finished his geological survey. His final report noted 3 new viable mineral deposits in the ridge formation east of the colony. He submitted it on time. Lena Burke wrote up her complete field triage notes on Karath physiology in careful, thorough detail, and submitted them to the Colonial Medical Archive under the title Cross-Species Emergency Stabilization, Karath, Field Adapted Protocol, Vega 4. It became one of the most accessed documents in the archive within a year. The orange star continued its slow arc over the iron hills of Vega 4. The colony hummed with the sound of machinery and the quiet, ordinary work of people building something real in a difficult place. Humanity went about its day. It always did. The planet Vega 4 was not a beautiful world. It had no blue oceans, no green forests, and no warm winds. It was cold, dry, and covered in long stretches of dark iron rock. The sky was a dull orange most of the day because of the dim star it circled, and at night the temperature dropped so low that exposed water turned to hard ice within minutes. It was not the kind of place most people dreamed of living. But the people who had come to Vega 4 were not the kind of people who dreamed of easy things. The colony was called Dustfall. It sat in a wide, flat basin between 2 ridges of rock, made up of connected steel and polymer hab units that had been bolted together over the course of 12 years. There were 417 people living in Dustfall. They were miners, engineers, medical workers, technicians, and a small number of children who had either been born there or brought there young. But they had each other, and they had built something real in a place where nothing had existed before, and that meant something to all of them. Connor Walsh was the chief of security for Dustfall. He was 44 years old, broad across the shoulders, with short gray hair, and a face that looked like it had seen a number of things it would rather forget. He had spent most of his adult life working in difficult places, first in the military, then in colonial security, and now here. He was not the kind of man who talked much. He watched things instead. He paid attention to details that other people walked past. It was this habit that made him good at his job, and it was this habit that started pulling at him on the night the trouble began. It was the sensors on the eastern ridge that first caught his attention. The readouts were not dramatic. There were no alarms going off and no red lights flashing on his console. The numbers were just slightly off, flickering in a way that was too irregular to be a system fault and too subtle to be obvious to anyone who was not looking closely. Connor had been doing this long enough to know that when sensors acted like that, something was moving out there, something that was trying not to be noticed. He called Paige Ellison on the comm. Paige was 29, the colony's night watch coordinator, and one of the sharpest people Connor had ever worked with. She had a way of staying calm that made the people around her stay calm too, which was exactly the kind of quality you wanted in someone working the late shift on a frontier world. He told her to pull up the sensor logs from the eastern ridge and go through them quietly, without putting anything on the general channel. She just said, understood, and got to work. What neither of them knew yet was that 5 things had already landed on Vega 4, and none of them were human. The CareHFY were a hunting species. They came from a dense jungle planet far out in the galactic middle arm, and everything about them had been shaped by millions of years of being the most dangerous creature in their environment. They were nearly 3 meters tall, with heavy bones, thick layered muscle, and sensory organs that could detect a living heat source through solid rock at close range. Their skin was covered in a natural plating that was not quite bone and not quite shell, and they moved in complete silence when they chose to. But the CareHFY were not conquerors. They did not come to take land or resources. They came to hunt. It was the center of their entire culture, the thing they built their identity around, the way they measured worth and achievement. A successful hunt was not just a victory. It was a statement about who you were. The huntmaster leading this group was named Voruk Than. He was experienced and highly respected among the CareHFY northern clans. He had led hunts on 11 different worlds and had never come back without trophies. With him were 4 others: Geth, Soral, Dunmak, and Hevrak, the youngest of the group. Hevrak had only completed 3 hunts and carried the impatience of someone who had not yet learned what it cost to underestimate a target. When a CareHFY scout drone had first detected dustfall from orbit several weeks earlier, Voruk Than had reviewed the data carefully. The humans registered as small and physically weak by CareHFY standards. Their body heat signatures were low. They had no visible armor and no apparent defensive fortifications around the outer areas of the colony. Their recorded weapons were a type of chemical propellant firearm that the CareHFY had cataloged from encounters with other species centuries before. Those weapons were rated as a minor threat. Voruk Than had given the hunt a low difficulty classification. He expected to be finished in 3 rotations. Their ship came in on the dark side of the planet, running with its signal dampeners active, and dropped into low orbit without being detected by the colony's standard monitoring equipment. The CareHFY descended to the surface in individual drop pods that scattered heat signatures across a wide area to avoid forming a single detectable pattern. They landed 2 kilometers from the colony's outer boundary, in the shadow of the eastern ridge, and gathered without lights or sound. Voruk Than looked out across the flat ground toward the distant lights of dustfall and said nothing for a long moment. The colony looked quiet and still. A few lights moved along the outer pathway between buildings. The sound of machinery hummed faintly across the cold air. He signaled the group to fan out into their starting positions. The plan was straightforward. Test the outer edges first. Identify any response. Adjust from there. He did not expect much of a response. Back inside the colony, Paige Ellison had finished going through the sensor logs and was sitting very still at her console. She had found what Connor had suspected. The Eastern Ridge sensors had registered a series of brief, irregular contacts over the past 90 minutes. Each one was small, easy to dismiss individually. Together, they formed a pattern. Something had moved across that ridge, and it had done so carefully, taking its time between movements, as if it knew where the sensors were and was working around them. She called Connor and gave him her findings in a low, even voice. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Wake Luke Harmon. Don't use the general channel. And find Danny Price. He's on night shift at the East Depot. Tell him to stay where he is and not to go outside." Paige began making the calls without another word. Connor stood up from his console, picked up his gear, and looked out through the narrow reinforced window at the dark plain between the colony and the ridge. Whatever was out there had tried to arrive without being noticed. That told him one thing clearly. It knew what it was doing, which meant that whatever happened next was not going to be simple. He pulled on his jacket and headed for the security room to start pulling up everything the Colonial Defense Database had on known Predator-class species that operated in this sector. Outside, in the cold dark, 5 Karath hunters moved silently toward the lights of Dustfall. Neither side was ready for what was about to happen next.